welcome to Coding After Work stream. Before we start, we would like to thank our fantastic sponsor, I would say, Progress Telerik. They have amazing Blazor UI components with over 75 components, I think it is.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're working with Blazor, you should definitely give it a try. We will add a link in the chat. But before that, let's bring in our guest.
Let's do that.
Welcome, Kevlin.
Hey, so Jessica Rabbit and Roger Rabbit.
Yeah,
it's good to be here.
Jimmy and I, we had an agreement. Okay, so we were supposed to dress up in an Easter theme. Now I went full on, but
I got you covered.
You.
There we go.
Easter theme.
I'm Chicken McFly.
No.
What?
Okay, I'll give you chicken. Yeah.
I'm the McFly that is actually chicken.
So you chickened out and chose Chicken McFly. Am I getting that right?
This is brilliant.
There's a whole farmyard theme going on here. You know, I feel strangely, separate from it, but I'm good.
Yeah, and we've been visited by, well, they didn't actually ring the doorbell, but we have Easter witches coming over, like kids dressing up. But due to this pandemic, we put all the prepackaged candy on the porch and they just, well, go there and eat. Or hopefully
I love this
bring
idea.
them
Easter
home.
witches, that's great.
Yeah, they're on their way to this island where they worship the devil. I don't know. It's all for the candy.
Oh yeah, any excuse.
Yeah.
Any excuse for sweets and candy. It's just like, Halloween, whatever. It's
Yeah.
There's normally something dark and demonic, and there's some kind of magic blended in, and it's normally the darker shade of magic. Yeah.
But it's basically the same thing. We have witches. We have black cats. We have broomsticks. I don't know. Do we have broomsticks on Halloween? I don't know.
I assume
Could have.
so. And
although these
candy.
days, I kind of wonder if it should be more like vacuum cleaners. We've got to get with the times. It's brooms are not as common as they used to be.
That is true. Actually, our what do you call it?
I think you need to give me a little bit of a clue here.
We're starting out great. What the head of Sweden? That's not a king. Prime Minister? Maybe? I don't know.
I think we refer to the head
leader.
We refer to we refer to the Swedish Prime Minister. So that's kind of like the
let's call him
the head of the government.
I don't know. Yeah, something like that. He actually went out and said because of the pandemic, you had to park your broomstick, so you weren't allowed to actually go to this secret island. So there you go.
That's a good positive message. Yeah, I'm definitely on board with that. Yeah.
So, I think it was back in 2018 or something like that.
That's right.
We recorded a podcast with you, and we had a pre-show where we talked before we pressed record, and we talked about things that were really hard to say.
Yes.
And I've done some research. So the 3 hardest things to say is, I was wrong. I need help. And Worcestershire
This spicy ketchup sauce thingy.
Worcestershire sauce. Yeah, that's So that I think I think you've covered that, because that's actually one of those kind of like shibboleths. It's kind of a word that betrays, is somebody English or not? So now you've ended up that's appeared on the stream as Worcestershire. You see, that's the trick of the word. It's Cester. It's Worcestershire, but this is it. It's spelled Worcestershire, and it's pronounced Worcestershire. So, it's one of those things, if you can get all of that, because reasons, because history, because arbitrariness, and it's one of those things. And typically anybody who is attempting, who's making that kind of foolish mistake of looking at an English word and going, you know what, I'm going to approach this word as if you could pronounce the letters in a sensible fashion. It's just like, really? How long have you been hanging around this language? You know, even if it's your second or third language, it's a case of like, no, English is specifically designed to refute any kind of such simple interpretation. But that also works for first language English speakers in North America who really struggle with Worcestershire is a very common mispronunciation. It's Worcestershire. And so Worcestershire sauce is just, it's just one of those things. So yeah, it's there. It's not designed to make sense. And but one of the things I love about this is sometimes people say, look, English as the spelling system doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have a logical spelling system. I like to point out to people that this statement is incorrect. English has about 10, 11, 12 logical spelling systems all at once, simultaneously in the same space. That is the problem. It's not that it doesn't have one, it's that it has more than one. And that's the bit.
All.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's kind of like, it's the kind of question, what happens if you teleport two things into the same place? It's kind of like, what happens if you teleport two spelling systems into the same language? Or N for N being significantly larger than 2. And you get English. It's just like, okay, how should I approach this word? Well, let me think. Is it 400 years old or is it 800 years old? Has it gone a vowel shift? It's just like, okay, I'm going to have this go at that. And yeah, you may, or I still pronounce, I pronounce English place names incorrectly as well. I've, occasionally discover I pronounce, there's a place called Bicester. While we're on the Cesters, Bicester, it's spelled Bicester. Bicester. Kind of like the Bifrost, but not as exciting. But it's pronounced Bicester. And for years, I even went to Bicester and thought it was Bicester. But it's like, no, not a hope. So it's kind of, it definitely shows you're not from around there, or you've not come across that place. And there are other places in England that I'm sure that I would completely mess up if you showed me, oh, here's a little village outside the middle of nowhere. And here's the name. And you go, oh, well, that's this. And they go, ooh, no, you pronounced it as if it was this other place, or as if it was spelt sensibly. It's like, no. England is full of those. Yeah.
I have a similar issue with so we used to have these cheesemongers coming here from Britain, and one of my favorite cheddars,
Leicester,
one of the favorite cheeses, like
Red
Leicester,
Leicester.
until we arrived in London and they kept saying Leicester.
Yeah.
What is the cheese they talk about?
I don't know.
That sounds good. It tastes really like, it looks and tastes exactly like that Leicester cheese that we love. Isn't that funny? It's got two names. Yeah, exactly. And there are loads of examples like that. And the point is, you don't have any point of reference, because normally, if you read it in a supermarket, that's not, and if you say it and everybody else understands what you're saying, then you have no reason to correct it. And then one day it's just like, okay, everybody says this completely differently. Yeah. It's mostly anything ending with Cester seems to, it's related, but Worcester and Worcestershire and Leicester and Bicester, all of these things. Yeah. We blame the Romans for that one. The Cester comes from, that's Chester, Manchester, all of the Cesters and Chesters. That's Roman stuff.
Cesters and Chesters.
Yeah,
we learn English in school, and we're talking about Queen's English in school.
Well, at least
the Queen never goes to these places.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because you can't pronounce them.
And Jessica sees a lot of cooking shows and everything. So we thought
from Britain.
Yeah, from Britain. So we thought that going to London for the first time, this is going to be a breeze. We know this stuff.
Got this one.
So we thought.
And all the dialects, we were like, what did she say? What is... Are these words? Is this English?
And I'm pretty good with dialects, and especially so British, I thought. Because all of the British TV I've been watching since I was a child, basically. But when we were at what's the place? Planet Forbidden Planet.
Yeah, Forbidden Planet. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's two issues. One, there's no internet in all of UK. Well, there are internet, But if you're then very impatient, like I am, and very used to fast internet, and not actual modems connected to your card payment machine, then you will do lots of rude stuff. And I had no clue what the guy was trying to tell me, so I put in the card, I put in my PIN code, I waited for 2 seconds, and I yanked the card. That's what you do. Otherwise, the machine will start beep, right? Because take your card, it's done. However, when it takes 15 seconds to do a transaction, and I kept doing that, I think 3 or 4 times, it was kind of embarrassing because I couldn't understand a word what he was saying.
And he was trying to explain, keep the card in the machine.
Keep the card in,
We were like, well, we have nothing.
Actually, the funny thing is that a lot of the shops end up with seem to end up with really bad internet, or their internet is positioned in a way that is not favorable to where the tills are, where the payment tills are. And the Forbidden Planet, it's got the payment tills near the door. Whereas I think the office, because it's on 2 floors, so yes, I have been there a few times. That's actually just from a historical point of view, that's actually the 3rd place that the Forbidden Planet has been. It used to be on Denmark Street, which is where a lot of the music shops, guitar shops and things like that are. And there's Forbidden Planet and Forbidden Planet 2, which was around the corner. And Forbidden Planet 2 is all the film stuff and media stuff. And as a teenager, I used to hang out there quite a lot. And I must have read most of the books in Forbidden Planet 2 and half of them in Forbidden Planet just by staying there on Saturdays. And, I'd be there about 2 hours and then I'd leave because they had these beautiful, beautiful books that I could never afford. And then they moved to High Holborn, and then they moved to Shaftesbury Avenue. But yeah, Shaftesbury Avenue is the biggest one, but it's on 2 floors, one of which is the basement. And if I'm guessing that the office is probably downstairs, which probably means that's where the internet routers are, and and the payment is by the front door. It's about the furthest point you could possibly get, and there's loads of concrete for the signal to pass through. So there's something about shop design in this country that people are kind of thinking, we will make sure that the router is the furthest point possible from the payment systems, just to make sure that it's most likely to time out or receive other problems. But definitely.
I seem to remember this is a few years, like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, something. Might be even more actually. But they were connected to the actual phone line, so he had to yell to this lady, get off the phone because I need to pay. That's so,
and again, payment systems are always.
So I should have made the connection.
Behind. This is it. That's the other one. That's the other issue, is that there's a lot of these that are just like, I'm using the phone lines. What? But I think everybody's kind of moved on from that because 1, we have no open shops, and 2, everybody's completely given up cash. I think I last used a cash machine 12 months ago, maybe 13 months ago. It was, but that's just not a thing anymore. Which is kind of like makes my wallet a lot lighter. Not that I carried much, but that is my wife's common complaint is Kevlin, you never carry cash, and these days it's just like, why? But my cash consumption had gone down.
Hold of cash, I don't know what to do with it. No shops takes cash.
Yeah, that's right.
No,
you've got all places that won't. That's right. Yeah. So it's been interesting. It's one of those kind of classic questions. Who drove your digital transformation? Was it your CEO, your CTO, or COVID-19? And it's COVID-19. Who made your society cashless? And that I think is interesting because there's a couple of countries where I had noticed that in recent years when traveling, I was using cash less, and to the point that I actually stopped. I kind of made a kind of just for a bit of fun, I would say I get to the airport, it's all right, I'm not going to get any cash, I'm going to see if I can do the whole trip cashless. And the 2 countries that were always winners on this kind of bet were Norway and Sweden. I could, the last time I took Krona out for either of them, I can't remember, but they were always the winners. They were years ahead of everybody else. The big loser on this one was Germany, actually. I found that I needed cash massively. I even went to a couple of restaurants that said cash only. It's just like, so I turn up and then my German's not great, but it's I have what I refer to as Speisekartendeutsch, menu German, and I could read the sign on the door. It's just like, what? You don't take card, okay? And I'd love to know what's happened in the last 12 months, because I suspect that might have changed. But it is interesting. But Germany always scored really badly on this one. Yeah, I should have done a systematic study of this while I had the chance. Because I suspect that that's not going to be the same eventually when, I don't want to say when normal returns, because I think we're in a normal. I don't think it's the new normal anymore either. I think we've been in it long enough. But when things change in another way, then the experiment has been messed up. But I think in the 5 years leading up to 2020, there was an interesting difference in adoption of the degree of cashlessness of the society. What you could get away with.
That is true. So another passion of yours, except languages, is lean code. So I've heard.
Yes, indeed. Lean code. Yeah. So
what is that?
So the lean stuff's been around for a while. The term lean, I think, was adopted in the early 90s, trying to make sense of the kind of manufacturing paradigm that had been transformative in Japan, and had also influenced the US. It didn't have a name. I mean, in the 80s, people were calling it kind of like just in time. The idea of just having a very much a flow oriented approach. The idea that you would not have lots of inventory and stock. You wouldn't build up loads of things and have a large stock of pieces and parts for your vehicles or consumer products. And so your goal was to reduce inventory costs. And the idea was, well, if you can make the whole thing fit together as a kind of like a production pipeline and understand what you've got, then just in time becomes the thing. So, and we kind of see that hangover in vocabulary was started being used. JIT compilers, we've now tend to use that terminology a little less, but the idea of JIT compilers, that terminology hung over. But around the beginning of the 90s, the term lean was used, started being used, and became the way of talking about it. But around 2000, 2001, something slightly more interesting happened, is that people started saying, I wonder if there's something going on here with software. You know, can we apply the principles that we've seen in lean production to the world of software? The first person to do this explicitly, although I think others may have been influenced by it, and were certainly influenced by the thinking. So something like Scrum, actually, its backstory is in this. But the first person to actually say, hey, look, here's the lean stuff, and why don't we apply it to software, was Mary Poppendick. And she wrote a thing in 2001 called Lean Programming. And I think she was patterning the name after, at the time, it was extreme programming was very much on people's minds. The term agile had only just been kind of coined. That was kind of February 2001. But at the end of the 90s and around 2000, there was this kind of sudden wave of interest. It was like, oh, extreme programming. And people say, oh, yeah, these other 90s approach like DSDM, and there's this thing called Scrum. There's feature-driven development, FDD. There are a whole load of things. And people are saying, these are all, they were using the term lightweight. These are lightweight processes or lightweight methods. Now, the problem with the word lightweight in English is it has two basic meanings. One, hey, that's light in weight. In other words, the literal meaning. Lightweight is also really negative. If you describe a person as a lightweight, you're not paying them a compliment. You know, if you tell somebody, you know, it's just like, yeah, light, you know, their thinking is lightweight. Again, not a good thing. As a drinker, if you're a lightweight, not a good thing. These are all negative connotations. So going around saying, hey, I'm a fan of lightweight processes is just like, yeah, that's not so good. Hence, that, you know, we ended up with the term agile to kind of cover that as an umbrella. But at the time, the one that was really kind of shaking everybody up because it was so provocative and polarizing was extreme programming. The very name itself got people interested, either because it's just like hell yeah or hell no. You know, it has that kind of polarizing response. You know, some people are sitting there going like, yeah, I just used to be a code monkey, but now I can be an extreme programmer. You know, I can now associate myself with extreme sports and associate myself with coolness, like you see people programming on films. You know, I think my kids have become disappointed the fact that it's like, no, I'm sorry, kids, it really isn't like that. You know, when you see people coding in films, it's like there's only pounding industrial music in the background. Their faces are lit up with code. Yeah, multiple screens. I think we're achieving the multiple screens, but it's really just not as sexy and cool and last minute as it was made out to be. You know, a room full of people doing productive software development is kind of indistinguishable from a room full of people looking at pictures of cats on the internet. You know, from the outside, they are observationally identical. It really is not the pounding techno or industrial rock. You're just not getting that. But the idea of like, oh, extreme, that sounds really cool. And the emphasis on programming drew a lot of people in, but it also polarized a lot of people. They kind of like, I don't want to be associated with extreme sports. Extreme sports by their nature are high risk. I want my software development to be low risk, and trying to suggest actually maybe there's a bigger picture here. Maybe it's not just about the programming. There's more sociological things and organizational things. But even so, at that point, Mary Poppendick used the term lean programming to capture the idea. A couple of years later, she shifted with her husband, Tom. They wrote a book, Lean Software Development, and that was hugely, hugely influential. That really changed a lot of people's thinking. And there were a number of books that followed that, but actually it was that really that kind of changed. You kind of, if you listen to and look at the stuff that people were talking about around then, there was a real shift in how people were talking about their agile stuff at the time. And that was as a result of all the lean stuff. But as time has gone on, some things have become very, very positive. They're very clear identified movement, Kanban and lean and stuff like that. But also for a lot of people, lean, and indeed a lot of the agile stuff, has become very remote from what they feel is their work. As developers, initially, I think some people were engaged by, hey, look, extreme programming, this is all about the code, it's about me, it's about, but obviously we have to take a bigger picture. But in doing so, I think a lot of people became, disenfranchised. They felt there was more distance. Oh, that's not for me. That doesn't talk about the code face. It's talking about all the management things, which, maybe I recognize that that's important. But again, it's moved away from the code rather than being the big picture that should connect it. It's actually added distance. So one of the things that I had, and I actually did a couple of talks and stuff a number of years ago on lean code. I sort of said, well, and lean architecture, basically saying, well, let's take the basic principles of lean and then take them back to what does it mean to a developer? What does it mean from the point of view of my code? Let's actually take the little picture, of course, connect it to the big picture, but let's take that more personal picture and bring it back. And you could say that's in kind of sympathy with the kind of software craft movement, which kind of started existing because people felt, hey, guess what? I feel left out. What happened to all the extreme programming practices and all the really good, cool focus stuff? And so we've ended up with people filling the technical gap with software craft, DevOps, and so on. And lean code, it was a couple of years ago, I started thinking, maybe I need to revisit that idea. And I started looking at the basic ideas, thinking, every single one of these, and taking my inspiration from the Poppendicks. They said, hey, look, here's 7 lean principles. I sort of thought, well, what do those principles mean from the point of view of a developer, both in terms of their code and their practices and also the developers around them? Let's make it developer-centric and code-centric and look at it from that point of view, rather than framing it as, hey, you're a part of a large organization and there's a value chain. It's like, yeah, this is all true, but it doesn't relate to what you're doing. So if you like, lean code is my attempt to refocus back on the on where a lot of this stuff started from the personal journey. And of course, as the name suggests, a lot of it is about getting rid of stuff. It's about just traveling a little bit lighter. As developers, we have a habit of, adding stuff. It's just that's understatement. It's one of those things that, like, number of lines of code, it goes up. It's it just number of features, it goes up. Number of tools on a project, it goes up. In other words, we are very good at adding stuff, but we're not particularly good at removing stuff and recognizing that itself has intrinsic value. If you like, streamlining. In fact, in another universe, if there was not a name here, I would call this much more a streamlined way of thinking about things. It's about making something more aerodynamic. To make something more aerodynamic, you get rid of stuff. You find the right shape for the path that you're trying to take, and that may be different in different cases. So I was trying to take a view of what sometimes people call, that people have these different ideas. There's clean code and all the rest of it. And of course, yes, there was a deliberate play on the word clean code, phrase clean code with lean code. But trying to make that grounded in slightly more kind of human values, but then try and say, this is why this naming practice makes sense. This is perhaps why you want to consider testing in this, unit testing in this way. This is how to think about what you're trying to communicate to your colleagues using all of the available tools and media that you have. So yeah, that's the basic motivation behind Lean Code. I haven't told you anything specific really, but it is just it's that idea of like streamline. It's getting rid of stuff in order to improve the flow, and that I think, but to try and take it back to the programmer and make it much more personal at that level.
That sounds good.
It does. So 7 principles.
7, yeah. Well, so Mary identified these kind of based on her experience in lean manufacturing and things like the Toyota, and reading up and researching on things like the Toyota production system, kind of distilled out 7 kind of what she referred to as principles. But I actually, if you look at them in the original book, they are much more directives. And I thought I tend to have a difficult relationship with the idea of design principles. The reason I say that is because I think a lot of the things that are framed as principles, what is a principle? A principle is in many ways something that is universal. So I think that's a very strong claim for a lot of things. And, and I'm, if you like, I'm much more of a patterns guy. My background is in the patterns community. I've written a couple of books on patterns. And for me, what some people see as patterns, they just think, oh, it's names for certain pieces of design. There's a bit more to it than that. But one of the most important things that I learned from getting into patterns was the value of context in design and in good practice. The idea that I can't just present you with something cold, an idea, and say, this is the practice. It's a good practice. And that's a very simple way of thinking, and we do love a simple way of thinking, and particularly with all the complexity. When developers are dealing with a lot of complexity, the point is you want simple things, but sometimes we oversimplify them. We attach to something that's too simple, it's simplistic. And there's this idea that we start beating each other over the head with, hey, this, you violated the very language. There's a principle, you should follow it, and there's a violation of that principle. It's like, okay, we need to take this down a little bit. And say, actually, is there so let me give you a very simple example. From the Pragmatic Programmer, wonderful book, absolutely, one of my favorite development books, published originally just over 20 years ago, and they came out with a second edition a couple of years ago, Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas. And one of the most enduring principles from that people remember is the DRY principle, DRY, don't repeat yourself. Often talked about in terms of avoiding duplication in code and so on. But actually, it's a much deeper idea than that. It's avoiding duplication of knowledge and process. So it's just like, hey, you're manually testing that again. Maybe you should try and automate the testing. In other words, that repetition, maybe that deserves to be understood and captured and placed somewhere. Whether we are talking duplication in code, coincidental or intentional, copy and paste style, or otherwise. So we talk about that, DRY principle, and that. For a lot of people, that's they will stand by that. But there is also when you don't want to follow that. That for me is the important thing. For me, it's a pattern. There is a context in which it makes sense. In fact, there's many contexts in which it makes sense. But there are also incredibly well-defined contexts which are their own rules, if you like, where you say, actually, you don't want to do this. Maybe that is the fact that you've got these two things is they're similar, is coincidental, and they share a moment in time of being similar, but who knows what's going to happen to the software. These two components are similar more by coincidence than by intention, and they are subject to different business rules, or they relate to different technologies, and over time they might diverge. But I've also had the experience where I've seen people try too hard, and that was the reuse message that people had kind of still kind of get pushed on them. I'm not going to say, oh, don't reuse, but I'm very, very cautious and have been for a very long time about we're going to make reusable. The goal here is to make reusable stuff. It's like, there's an extra cost there, and you might actually just add complexity or speculation. And that idea, it becomes a problem. And I've seen this play out in a couple of companies where they tried, as it were, too hard. And you ended up with two different products actually ending up being coupled to each other because of an attempt to do reuse. And yet these two things actually had very independent business cycles within the organization. And trying to couple them together through reuse actually caused immense problems. One goal people have of reuse is to say, well, we're going to reduce the duplication of effort. That team's done something, let's take advantage of it. That sounds great. The problem is, if that idea is not stable, and this idea, then we couple to that and we are kind of thrown about by it. I think the best way of putting it is, it's kind of like a three-legged race, for which I don't know the various translations, but kind of kids race or drunken adults. Kids race where, two kids will kind of like, they'll tie their middle legs together and run a race. Okay, so a three-legged race, very popular in primary schools in the UK. The point is, what makes if you're going to do this, what makes you successful? It turns out actually having the same stride length, the same leg length, makes a big difference. So when my younger son, he was kind of one of the shorter kids in the year, his best friend was one of the tallest kids. And he said, "Oh, I'm going to do the three-legged race with James." And it's just like, can we suggest you don't? Because your pace, that's not going to work out well. Choose Connor, because his legs are the same. You're actually about the same height. In fact, the teachers even confuse one for the other. So it's just like, go for that. And the point there is that when you're in a rhythm, then suddenly that makes sense. Here are two different parts of the software system that are in sync with one another. They have a similar life cycle. They've been around for the same kind of thing. They're kind of moved by the same kind of requirements, forces, disturbed in the same way. And suddenly factoring stuff out gives you a huge advantage. It stops rework. It's fantastic. But if you've got one thing that's plodding along, regular release, but not necessarily frequent, but it's a code base that's 10 years old, and you've got another code base that's like 3 months old, and it's just like wild and changeable, and it's using it's a particular project I have in mind was using, you had two different eras of .NET, and there's the problem of, it was just a mismatched gearing. And so what was happening is that both projects were fighting each other, and attempting to apply the dry principle is actually slowing them down and causing them to create errors. So in that sense, it's not a universal principle. It's good default advice. In other words, it's one of those things of like, 90, let's call it a 95% rule, 90 to 95% of the time, this is great, but there's a really well-defined sense where actually adding duplication or tolerating duplication reduces coupling. So there's this interesting thing about trade-off. We normally think, coupling, cohesion. Sometimes actually duplication versus coupling. It's a case of like a little bit of duplication here reduces the coupling between these services and these projects. So the first thing there is, principle is a very particular word. So when I'm thinking about the lean principles, I thought, actually, I'm not going to use lean principles. And they were phrased as directives. And I think the original ones were eliminate waste, and build quality in. In other words, they're verb phrases, they're imperatives, they're telling you to do something, create knowledge, deliver fast, and so on. And they're all mostly good, but there's a couple that I found a little bit misleading. The one for me that always got me was eliminate waste. I'm definitely not a big fan of that term, because eliminate is it's a very binary thing. Eliminate waste is very absolute. It's just like, whoa, hang on. You've set yourself up to fail. If that's your principle, you have actually set yourself up to fail, because there will always be something that doesn't need to be there, because software development is dynamic. If it were static, you'd reach a perfect equilibrium and say, and now we have eliminated everything that we consider to be waste. But by its very nature, it's dynamic. So there's always going to be something that you don't necessarily need. It's like when you're refactoring. If I'm refactoring from code from one design to another design, there's a point in between, which is kind of like if you stop the music there, it would be an imperfect design because it's got a bit of duplication and redundancy. But that's because we've not understood it as a dynamic system. We are moving from here to here. So the redundancy in the middle it's like walking. You have 1 foot, then 2 feet, then 1 foot, then 2 feet. And in other words, you are sometimes you have more than you need to balance. That's a difference from running, which is an unstable configuration. The idea here is to go for a stable configuration, and we do that by tolerating a little bit of stuff we don't necessarily need. So walking works in a particular way, and it's this idea of like moving, refactoring from one thing to another. There's a bit in the middle which may not, particularly the larger refactorings, that may not actually be good if you were to stop everything there, but it's kind of good because you're not stopping there. In other words, there's an arrow of time that we need to take into account. So for me, eliminate waste that's just too harsh. That's just really, it's a little bit totalitarian, and people could become obsessed with it. It's like, we must not tolerate waste. It's like, hang on, no. If you are always, the only time you're ever able to eliminate waste is when your product is dead. At that point, you can get rid of it. There is no change. If you like, it's kind of like it's like eventual consistency for code bases as opposed to data. It's eventual consistency to recognize that the whole idea of eventual consistency is your data. Eventually, if there are no other changes in your system, the data will become consistent. But for as long as there are events changing it, there will be some level of inconsistency. And I think it's exactly the same with a code base. If your code has reached stasis, there's a good chance either it's absolutely perfect or your project is dead. If it reaches perfect stasis, the point is nothing's happening. Whereas a project is actually, it's in flow, it functions in time. So there's always going to be waste, and that's okay. So in other words, for me, it's reduce waste is a better thing than eliminate waste. But then we've also moved away from the idea of the language of waste, because that doesn't tell you what you should be doing. In other words, eliminate waste, and it's just like, what's the good stuff? What am I trying to do? But there's also, you end up in lean, there's a whole load of crazy vocabulary. One of the bits that always used to bug me was that you ended up with a concept of necessary waste and unnecessary waste. And I thought, okay, we've gone off the deep end. Necessary waste, then it's not waste. This is an oxymoron. This doesn't make sense. You've become so vested in the vocabulary, and this doesn't come from the Poppendics. This comes from the broader lean world. It's just like, it's when your vocabulary starts doing that, you start thinking, no, stop, everybody. Fortunately, there is a way we can reframe this. People have become, what is it you're trying to get? So for me, reduce waste is better, but actually what you're actually trying to do is increase value, increase the value of what you're doing. And value is a magnificently ambiguous term. It has so many different interpretations. So here, value is, well, what you're doing is that the usual lean thing is this of value to the business? I actually want to start from a different place. Is this of value to the developer? Let's start, is that line of code, is that helping you? Is that comment? You put a whole section of comments in there. Is that adding value? Or if you change the code to get rid of the comment, if you made the comment superfluous, I have changed my code so it doesn't need the comment, which one gives you the greater value? And so in other words, it's this idea of every single line of code or every expression, every decision there should probably have a reason for being there. And it just makes us a little more focused on the code. What is is this communicating to somebody else? Is there value in this? Or have I just got a lot of boilerplate? So in other words, it's reframing a lot of our coding practices from that point of view. Does this have value to you in the future, to your colleague, to the runtime system? Oh yeah, here's a bunch of features that are never going to be used. Well, that's dead code. Okay, so dead code has no value here. In fact, it has negative value. So what I did was realizing that, I then decided instead of principles, I'm going to go for goals. Things that we have, 7 goals, and so I can actually list off. So they actually correspond very closely to the Poppendics ones. Actually, another one I also had issues with, but only realized relatively recently. They talked about deliver fast, and I've noticed we have an obsession with speed. This can either be quoting.
Feels familiar.
So there's this obsession. We find it in the way that people say, the need for speed. So we start quoting films from the 80s, and then we start using old engineering maxims. So move fast and break things. Facebook have recently popularized that. Move fast and break democracies. Stuff like that. But actually, it's an old engineering adage. It comes from the 1950s, I believe, and there is this idea of like, well, hang on, there's an obsession here. We talk about velocity in projects, project velocity, and actually it turns out most of the time people aren't talking about velocity. If we're in a technical domain, then velocity has a very specific meaning. It means that something has direction and it has a magnitude. So if somebody says, a lot of projects are actually not focused on velocity. They are focused on speed. They're burning through story points or, whatever it is, however they're measuring it, they're racking up their speed, but not paying attention to their direction. And this obsession with that kind of stuff, it runs all the way through our vocabulary. I've got stuff, submissions, even in the recent book I edited with Trisha G, 97 Things Every Java Programmer Should Know. There's a couple of items there, brilliantly written, but I wasn't going to take issue with the titles that focus on deliver faster or do something fast. I even spoke at an event for a company. It was about a year and a half ago, and it was an internal conference. And I did a lean code talk there. And it was only when I got up on stage that I realized the slogan for their conference was, better software faster. And I suddenly said, I'm going to talk against the fast bit here. What the goal is actually much more subtle. And in other words, so for me, a lot of this is trying to take a lot of these pieces of, find the good bits of advice that we normally push around to one another in terms of naming or testing and things like that, and give them a slightly better home and a better model of understanding, but also get away from some of the kind of dysfunctional thinking that we've ended up with, which is a real shame. It kind of holds us back, and we pick up the thought patterns. We don't realize we're doing it, and those become that frames the way that we think. And this idea of faster is just like, ease up. It's not. It's deliver sooner, not faster. And there's such a subtle difference there, because faster
and we're apparently not the only ones suffering from hearing this everywhere. Stacey's one of them too.
So there's this idea of obsession with the speed, and what we're getting from people is speed and busyness and all the rest of it. Whereas actually, what we want is get there sooner. And I was kind of, whenever I'm trying to make this point to people, I always use this. We can. I'm sure we can all think of developers that we know that might initially qualify as the 10x developers. It's just, oh yeah, that person really cranks out code. I remember working with somebody who just cranked out loads of code and then he left. I remember having how much of that code I had to get rid of, but also how much of it I could replace with something that was simpler and more direct. In other words, there's nothing wrong with writing a whole load of stuff. You always recognize that that's your first draft. I think that's another thing we get stuck with. Our first draft. We don't appreciate that sometimes with code, we're thinking out loud, and that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, unless you give yourself the second chance, then you're stuck with that. That becomes your technical debt, and it becomes unmanaged. So it's this idea of our goal should be to deliver sooner rather than faster. And sometimes that involves actively stepping back from something, trying to figure out, oh, you know what? There's a library for this. Or if I think about it from a different paradigm point of view, it becomes a lot simpler. I'm writing all this boilerplate code, force a habit, and maybe I'm using an IDE. One of the great things about IDEs is they allow you to do the wrong thing at immense speed. It's just like, yeah, it can generate all the getters and setters for me. And it's just like, no, actually, you don't want all those setters. In fact, even, you end up with, rather than a rich object model, for example, you end up with just basically DTOs everywhere, and the big controllers that have all of the logic, rather than a nice distribution of responsibility through the code. So there is this idea that we're in a rush, and we need to take into account the idea of direction. Velocity includes direction. It doesn't matter if somebody says, "Hey, look, I'm driving really." In fact, I had this experience years ago on a ring road around Brussels. I was driving. I got my directions muddled up. I have a very poor sense of direction, and so I'm driving along at great speed. It's just like 120 kilometers per hour. Yep, doing really well. Why is the sun in the wrong place? Turns out I was heading in the wrong direction. I mean, at least I had the sense, I have a terrible sense of direction, but I do know, I have a rough idea where the sun should be, and it's just like, it's in the wrong place. Okay, I'm not heading where I need to go. And it was one of those, okay, stop, look around, figure out what's going on. And that's the problem, is a lot of people go, yeah, 120 kilometers per hour. Oh, okay, which direction you go? I'm heading north. You should be heading south. In fact, you would be making better progress if you walked south. That's the problem. So there are, if we relate that to software development, we can actually see that this idea of direction is kind of like the old adage of the right thing in the right way. It's not just, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing it in the right way? In a way that helps ourselves actually have to do less in the future. And again, that lean thinking is just like lean, the implication of less. There is a reduction there. We're trying to get rid of the stuff that we don't want to have to do. It's the there is this idea of I think in the original Agile manifesto, one of the 12 principles, that they talked about the art of maximizing the work not done. And sometimes that means you need to take a step back. It doesn't mean you're going to do everything perfectly. It just means that you're going to learn from everything that you do, which sometimes means slow down a bit. You'll get there sooner by slowing down. So in other words, I decided I'm going to rephrase these 7 principles or directives. 7. Let's use the right numbers, the right number of fingers. So I thought, right, value. Okay, that's the first one. Quality. Okay, the intrinsic quality of something that is built. We want that as a goal. Knowledge. What we do is knowledge work. And this is, I used to think that was just one of those kind of like business labels, knowledge work. Oh, you're a knowledge worker. And it's just like, and then I started realizing, there's a deeper truth here that I had not seen before and probably wasn't even intended originally. But actually what software development is about knowledge. It's not, I don't just mean about, hey, I'm learning a new technology. It's what you are trying to do is effectively applied philosophy, applied epistemology. You're trying to understand a domain. You're trying to understand, in fact, multiple domains. There is typically a business domain, the domain of the world that you're trying to target with an application. But there's also the technical domain, and that has its own vocabulary and its own connections. And this is the crazy thing. We're trying to understand both of these and then bring them together. We are trying to craft something, a codified body of knowledge, quite literally codified. Our code is trying to bring these worlds together, and we are using paradigms to phrase it. It's all ultimately a work of fiction. You could do it all in theory. You could do it all in assembler. And the only reason I ever say that is to kind of remind people there is nothing intrinsically necessary about the objects that you have chosen and the functions you've decided on. You're doing those for other people. You're organizing knowledge. You're saying, okay, this is really complex. Let me shape it in a way that makes sense to you. And you're trying to form a mental model and put it in somebody else's head via source code. That's an amazing challenge to take up, but that's what you're doing, is you're organizing knowledge, and every decision you make, which might be framed in terms of encapsulation and other kind of guidelines, is about this. When we talk about naming conventions and things like that, we're not talking about labeling. Sometimes people think, better names, or disagreeing over names is, we're coming up with better labels. It's not labeling. You're actually giving somebody a thought model by changing the way that you think about and organize your methods, your classes, and so on. You're actually giving somebody a different set of suggestions about this is how to think about it. And so what you want in any development is you want knowledge. That's a goal, and you want to make sure that knowledge is captured and it's living. It's no good if it's just sitting in your head. I worked with a guy years ago, genius 10x programmer type guy, absolutely brilliant. And he was very good at explaining things as well. And his documentation, he was one of the rare examples I would say, actually, this guy can write. He writes good documentation, good architectural documentation. And then I went and looked at the code, and it's just like, if I had not been given the mental model already through conversation and this documentation, I would not have seen it. It's kind of like it got compiled into a kind of assembler on the way down from here to his fingertips. By the time it came out, it worked. It showed mastery of the language and all the rest of it. But the problem is, it was too low level from the point of view of the mental model that was actually present. And clearly he was thinking in a model, but then not communicating it in the code. And it's a case of like, we want to maximize that. We want to make sure that knowledge endures. And so this affects our naming. It affects our check-in comments. It affects the idea of what is it that we're trying to do when we test. We're not simply writing tests to check the code is all right. We have an opportunity. Writing a test is an act of communication. We're trying to tell somebody, not check whether or not it works. It's actually the biggest problem people have is, what do you mean by that it works? That's actually the harder thing. So everything that we do, all of these things, they can serve to communicate knowledge. So that becomes kind of principle number, or goal number 3. Change is normal. Change is a paradox for humans. I came across a saying a while back. 2 things that humans hate: things staying the same, things changing, and that's that's the paradox we have to live with. But the problem is, we end up we either refuse to acknowledge it, or we over-engineer. We add guesswork. That's not knowledge, that's guesswork. And we try and eliminate. So this is another use of the word eliminate. And I recognize, I've seen this with a number of architects, is what they're trying to do with some of their over designs is eliminate change. It's like, don't do it. It's not going to work. And you're actually going to cause people, you're going to give them a lot of baggage to take into the future. So in other words, rather than reducing the workload in future, you're actually going to increase it, because you're going to take all this guesswork in the code that has now actually shaped all the key decisions in the system. And the chances are the future did not work out the way you expected, but you still got to carry this baggage. And you've now got to deal with the future, which has come along looking differently. So there's this idea of understanding change. We want things to be changed, but changeable, but to discover what should be changeable takes time. In other words, we need to add that time dimension. We need to be observant of our code. Sure, we can guess, but the trick is, sometimes we have a history. We can look back at the code and go, oh, this always changes. This is a change hotspot. Maybe we should make it easier to change. This reflects a set of requirements that are actually unstable in the real world. Okay, maybe we can encapsulate something here, or add an interface, or separate something, and therefore isolate those changes and stabilize it. So in other words, rather than planning for change, what we're going to do is actually see the change that exists and respond to that. Otherwise, you end up with I run a number of workshops. One of those common things when I ask people, what do you want in good code? Oh, everything should be changeable, or good code is changeable. It's just like, that's so non-specific. It's not useful and could actually be quite harmful as a piece of advice. I mean, a class should be totally changeable, and you should be able to change it in any way. It's just like, really? Be careful with that one, because otherwise you're going to add extension points everywhere. You're going to end up with. I think the ultimate class is, or the ultimate interface is an interface with one method called do something, and it takes a string and then a variable argument list and returns object. Here, that is the ultimate. That is the ultimate generic interface. But actually, that doesn't solve our problem. So the idea is, use the fact that things change to your advantage. Observe the changes. And try to group them. Sometimes, in other words, have an initial idea, but again, that goes back to this, what I was saying about the first draft idea. Understand that it's perfectly okay to write a piece of code that sucks, as long as you understand that you will come back to it. If you don't have a process for change, then writing a piece of code that sucks is a liability. But then demands something that's very non-human. We end up giving ourselves a standard we can never achieve. You must write perfect code, because you're never going to get a chance to do it again. It's just like, can we not adopt a process that lets us adapt? So I think that change as a goal is encompasses all of these things. And there's a related one, is the next goal, flow. That's what we want. We want flow. People talk about the flow state, but we see it in development as well. We talk about pipelines. There's a flow there. We don't want to end up with, like, I spent 6 months hacking away at the code. Now I'm going to spend 2 months debugging everything, and testing everything, but it actually turns out to be debugging. And there's the kind of flow. But there's also, what if I have an idea? What about the flow of work? When people talk about things like test-driven development, what I normally try and do is, so I teach TDD. But I'm very careful to say, when I teach this stuff, I say, right, there's actually 2 things I want to teach you. One is test-driven development, because the chances are you don't do it, and there's no point in going on a training course to do what you already do. So let's do that. In other words, so that you have a better you can better recognize when you could use it. If you've never used it before, then it's just an abstract idea. If you've tried it out, then you have a much better understanding. But the other aspect is what I talk about as the good unit tests. What do you leave behind? That's the quality and the knowledge aspect. Is what you leave behind, somebody's not going to see. They're not going to look in the repo, look at your code and go, oh, I see this has been TDD'd. You can't see that. That's a process that happens in time. The TDD is the thing that you do. It's a flow. But also there are other flows. Iterative test last. In other words, instead of writing test, then code, then test, then code, I code, then test, then code, then test. But it's very fine grained. It's still, if you like, interleaved in time. But it has a slightly different rhythm. You lead with a different foot. Then there is plain old unit testing, or pouting, which is where you go, I'm going to work on a feature and then I will test it. And that's a very common one. And when we say and then I will test it, it means I worked on the feature, then I will test it, not I worked on the feature. Maybe when was it? Last August. Well, now it's April. Maybe I should test it. No, bring them together in time, but it's a different granularity. Then we have defect-driven testing, which is the idea of actually we wrote the code, we missed something, there was a bug. So now we write a one or more tests to respond to that bug, increases our knowledge because we've now got traceability there. Hey, here's a thing we missed, but now we haven't. And we've also got the traceability that it runs red first of all because of the bug, and now you know when you fixed it. So you've got much stronger traceability than just signing it off. But so for me, it's like all of the workflows, I'm not kind of favoring one, but appreciate what the landscape is. How do we work in time with things? So it's appreciating the different shapes that these give you and the different kind of consequences they have and the different situations you can apply them. So that's flow. And then goal number 6, people. Honestly, we're really bad at remembering that a lot of the time. But you're always, when you're writing code, 1, you are human. 2, your colleagues are human. One of the greatest discoveries of the last few decades is that software developers are actually human beings. This was a shock and a revelation to many people, but it means that we share a bunch of cognitive biases, illusions about ourselves and our own thinking, just like the rest of the human race. I did a series of talks about 10 years ago on cognitive biases and effects, with a complete disclaimer: I'm not a psychologist, and I'm quite happy to say that I'm just a geek that's interested in this stuff, and that's become a lot more normal now. We find a lot more people trying to bring this recognition of psychology, the fact that, hey, guess what, we're human. That means we have all these human failings and all these biases. And we therefore don't see certain things. We're very poor at understanding our own thinking. And whenever I remember 10 years ago doing this talk, I had so many people come up to me afterwards and say, yeah, you're right, I've seen this in other people. It's just you need to look in the mirror. I'm afraid that one of those people is you. We're really bad at that. So there is this idea that we are doing a bunch of this stuff. First of all, recognize that human psychology is filled with all kinds of shortcuts, many of which help us, but a lot of which work against us in certain cases, particularly when things like the pressure is on. But then there's another side to this in terms of people is genuinely appreciating. That's why people debate, curly bracket positioning and naming conventions. The reason we do that is because we're talking about communication. This is actually social negotiation. It's a sort of a necessary part of teamwork. But many people do not work on their own. So therefore, a lot of these things that we are not fundamental. They're actually social negotiation. They're kind of you're actually coming to some kind of agreement or disagreement, but it's not an absolute truth that you're getting at. What you're trying to do is work out. And if you look at it like this, it makes a lot more sense. If you're not trying to work out the one true way, this is the coding guidelines. What you're trying to do is figure out what are the ground rules that we are going to work to. How do we agree to work with one another? It's like, things like how do we cross the road type stuff. It's at that level. But at the team and with the code is where people are living, and there's a desire to make it habitable. So that means that we have to kind of respect certain conventions, not all of which can be reasoned from first principles. They're actually social negotiations. And then honestly, there's the other bit, is that as human beings, you have no idea what other people are going through. So sometimes we can be very judgmental, short-tempered. And I think I really like April Wenzel's move on things like compassionate coding. She had a really good way of looking at this. I absolutely love this. It's this whole idea of like, we should be a little more compassionate. And we often talk about passion. You know, it's fiery, and it's kind of and it's just like, yeah, up to a point. But then we also counterbalance it with dispassion, but that objectivity. But again, sometimes that can put too much distance between us and the things that make things fun. And we are humans. Things should be fun, but they should also be, we must tolerate our own behaviors and others, and actually respect the human being. Overtime culture, terrible thing. It turns out that if you want to improve people's work, make sure they get enough sleep. It turns out that's going to have, who knew? That's going to have way more effect than most of the productivity hacks that people are into. Honestly, a good night's sleep will make the biggest difference. People's mental health undergoes cycles and fluctuations. And I think we've, in the last year, that's been thrown into sharp relief, that developers are human. You've got to respect that. You have no idea what's going on. So it's the people centrism of the practices we need to follow that actually start with the code, but actually go out to kind of how we treat our colleagues. And then kind of the last kind of goal is holism. We're very good at reductionism in code. Very good, if you like, analytical. But you've got to put it all together. It's the context thing. Here is a great piece of code. Well, how do you know it's great? If I put it in this context, it's really bad. If I put it in this context, it's not so great. This piece of code might be over-engineered for one context. It might be, it's just like, wow, you're really paranoid. Oh, I understand. It's for a medical system. Oh, no, that's fine. As you were. All of those checks, all of that extra stuff, totally appropriate, but maybe overkill if somebody's just, social media app. It's just like, yeah, that's unnecessary. So in other words, the context is what dictates the value or the quality of a piece of code. You kind of got to look at the big picture, and that gets us thinking as well. Because I did this thing recently. I was talking about thread safety, and it was, people often get upset. Yeah, is this code thread safe? And it's, well, yeah, all code is thread safe. Yeah. What you need to do is define your thread safety. This class, but it doesn't have any locks in it. Yeah, it's perfectly safe if you pass one thread through it. Define your threading model. Actually, most code should not be shared between threads. There's some code whose thread safety is 0 threads. It's so terrible and so bad and so dangerous that if you it's only safe if you pass 0 threads through it. In other words, thread safety is a matter of understanding and kind. And it's an architectural decision. So thread safety, maybe it's all immutable. So it's where is this line of code going to appear? But it also gets us thinking about, you got this system and you got this system. When they interact individually, both of these could be correct. I've got this component, they're both individually correct. But when I bring them together, what happens? So holism is take a step back, look at the bigger picture, because we do get drawn into the detail, but then you've got to zoom out again and go like, well, where's this going to live? Have we over-engineered this? Have we respected the execution context in terms of its time, what I broadly call the time model, so threading, events, and so on. How does time flow through our code? What is the nature of time in our code base? And that may make a good piece of code poor or justify a practice we would normally caution against. In this case, it's actually quite good. But it also gets us thinking about some of the code that we're doing and the bigger context. And I kind of half-jokingly mentioned Facebook and breaking democracy earlier on, but it's one of those things of like, we are responsible for, it's this area of, if you like, digital ethics. We are responsible for an awful lot of things that are not particularly good at the moment, indirectly. I'm not going to go around, this is not a finger-pointing exercise, but there is a case that sometimes we need to take a step back and go, where's this going to be used? So a number of years ago, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, somewhere in the early 2000s, I was contacted by somebody and they were doing a lot of face recognition stuff. And they really wanted to get my involvement. And then I started looking and it's just like, and now I'm going to start walking away because I started thinking, this is ahead of, I started thinking that you're using the language of security and stuff like that. And I just don't think this is the right way. This is too easy to abuse. And I don't want to be involved in design work or code work or review work that's going to contribute to this because I feel uncomfortable. And yes, I would like to, if you're going to have this, it would be nice to have a better system rather than a worse system. But my preference is to not have a system and to actively say, no, this is not, there is a line here I'm not going to cross. We can't always see the line. So never beat yourself up about not seeing the line. But there are cases where we can start saying, yeah, you know what, we need to pay more attention to this. We got maybe wrapped up, and there's a lot of machine learning stuff here in the biases that are innate in that. And sometimes people, oh, don't worry about that. We'll fix it. We'll fix it afterwards, or we'll adjust the algorithm afterwards and stuff like that. It's just like, actually, this is a deeper problem, and we're tackling it the wrong way. And sure, some of the stuff's really cool, but holism also means taking the step back of like, how is this being used? What am I contributing to something that I can influence and change the direction of? Am I contributing to something that is intrinsically good in another way? Or am I accidentally contributing to something that I'm only now learning may be problematic? Perhaps I didn't see it before. What's my response to that? So again, if you like, there's kind of like a big picture message there about we need to realize we're part of a bigger picture. There's a responsibility there. So that's kind of like the 7 goals, if you like, of lean code, looking at the code and the people around you from the point of view of value, quality, knowledge, change, flow, people, and holism. And that kind of gives us a place to hang all our little other observations and micro practices against and say, oh yeah, it forms part of a bigger picture, and I can see it like that. So have I sold you on it? Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would like to go back to the people part.
Yeah.
We can all agree on the people that are using spaces instead of tabs are psychopaths, right?
Don't. That's what he's talking about, right? Take a step back.
Take a step back. Yeah. I don't even know if Jessica agrees with this, and if we're about to break up a happy marriage here. So I'm not even going to go there. But I'm just going to say, you folks out there who are only using 2 spaces of indentation or 1. I have lines that I'm not going to cross here, man. But I will say that 3 is absolute barbarism. It's a failure to embrace. 3 is the ultimate failure to embrace 4. But yeah, but there you go. Social negotiation. That's the thing. So sometimes the funny thing is ending up, I'll code this way because actually, you may. There's a trade. Sometimes there's a trick to understanding that sometimes what you do is like, well, how strongly do I feel about this? Well, I feel more strongly about this. I'll tell you what, I'll give you this if you give me that. There's a kind of, but I think that that's also another thing that we need to recognize, because we like to think of a lot of things as if they were givens of the universe, that they were fundamental, but actually they're much more sociological. And so therefore, when we understand the value of some things, is in the value of exchange and allowing people to work together. It's like, oh, okay, I'm prepared to compromise on a couple of things. And I have used both spaces and tabs in the past, and I'm not proud to admit it. But I think you might be wrong on the tabs. Or rather, if tabs convert to spaces, is a tab just a way of generating spaces? That's the way I prefer to think about it. But of course, there is this idea, if you have that consistently on a particular code base, then it's like, oh, okay, that's the culture here. I'll do that, rather than rigidly follow something and say this is always right. So it's like, why? If I looked, it's one of those things sometimes to think, if I jumped in a time machine and went 20 years in the future or 20 years in the past, would this still sound as universal as it sounds now? Or is it just one of those things that, we're doing it at the moment, who knows, next year skinny jeans will be back, or that kind of thing. It's one of those things that we have these various cycles, and we may have an opinion about it. In fact, that's something I found really useful a number of years ago, is to become more careful about how I was framing advice. I get a lot of questions about, is this a good idea? Should I do this? And it's just like, okay, let's take a step back from that. First of all, this particular idea, so this particular practice, should we allow duplicate code? Let's pick on an example I've already talked about. Should we eliminate duplicate code? And it's just like, that's perhaps a little bit strong. What's the problem we're trying to solve here? Let's take a step back from this. I said generally it's a good idea, but there's also a soft case where what you're being invited to do is think. There's a question here. And then there are some things of like, yeah, honestly, that's a really bad idea on the whole. Generally avoid that. And I can offer you that as an objective thing, but I'm also careful to distinguish certain things where I say, I have a preference and that's my opinion. But honestly, you may have a different opinion and that's totally cool. Maybe we'll never agree on that, but it's not as kind of more significant as this other decision or this other convention that we're talking about, which is actually, that's going to make a difference to what people do in future. That's going to make a difference to the viability of the code, the correctness of the code, all of this kind of stuff. Whereas the other thing is just like, yeah, it's nice to have, and I can give you reasons for it, but I can also see that we could go another way and that would be acceptable in that case. So, which is a roundabout way of saying, once upon a time, I did use Hungarian notation. I never liked it, but I did use it on a project because that was what the rest of the team were doing. And, I gave my objections and eventually we abandoned Hungarian notation. So I can definitely say there's an I told you so. But the point is, I had to end with that. But the point is that there was that idea of like, okay, we're in this team, we're trying to do a bunch of stuff. Let's just try that. I could talk, vigorously against this practice. I'll let but actually there's other things that I think are possibly more important. But why don't we observe this? And what we observed was a number of issues that came up with it, and we eventually did reject it. And I could also imagine a development path where we didn't. But the more important, but that was one I was prepared to sacrifice because of other key decisions about how we were going to do event handling were for me much more fundamental and would genuinely change the future development path of that code in a much deeper way. And once we've settled on that, then we can talk about the fact that Hungarian there are issues for APIs. Our code base was closed, so there were no API longevity issues. Types don't generally, type evolution within a closed code base is far less of a problem than it is in a code base that is where parts are published to other people and they start depending on them. You can't refactor their code when you suddenly discover, yeah, you know what? That thing that we said was a byte. It's not a byte anymore. We can't change the name because that'll break everything. Oh, so now we're going to have a convention that lies to everybody. Genius. So in other words, that's my killer blow. Guaranteed. This is why Hungarian notation was always wrong. But the point, because of APIs and code evolution, but in a closed code base, it's more, there's a different convention that we may accept. And we may say, yeah, because we can reach all the code, maybe it's less critical. Let's run that's an opinion. Let's run an experiment. And that is the change thing. That's the change. It's like, let's look at how things change. Let's run an experiment. Let's regard all of our development as hypothesis. Today, this is the best I can do, or this is the best idea I have. Tomorrow, you kind of look at it. It's just which idiot wrote? Oh, this idiot. Okay. Right. Or I got a good night's sleep, and so now you come back to it, and you've got to get. That's the other thing, the people aspect. You've got to give yourself the opportunity to learn. In other words, otherwise we hold ourselves to these impossible standards. It's the idea that. I had an idea yesterday, maybe I threw down a whole load of code. I was satisfied with it. I come back a few weeks later and I'm looking at it going like, wow, okay, there's a different, I don't understand what I was doing, or wow, so much verbosity. There's a simpler way of doing this. Or how did I completely overlook the fact that this is actually a standard library class? I can get rid of all of that code. Because that's basic self-compassion. You've got to understand you're not going to know everything. You're always working with incomplete knowledge. But give yourself that opportunity to change. So therefore, the eventual consistency thing comes back in again. So yeah, these are all connected in that sense. I think that's kind of important. So yeah, move away from the absolutes on this one.
I really like these kinds of discussions. I've had many of them with my co-workers, and I remember one time I think we were talking about the primary key in a SQL table. Should it be named table ID or just ID? And I believe I was on team table ID, and my coworker said, no, it should be ID. So we discussed this for hours. We couldn't agree. So we said, let's just go home. Let's sleep on it. We did, came back, and both of us had changed their opinions. So now we were on opposite teams again.
Yeah. But that's
so what
great
did you
because
end up do?
ID.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but that's the there's a nice point there, is the fact that time, sometimes we're not very good at appreciating the role that time has. In other words, sometimes it's like, sometimes we ask ourselves a question, or we ask a colleague a question. Sometimes what we almost need to do is like send a message to the future, ask the future the question. Honestly, I don't know this now. I'm working with incomplete knowledge, but I bet there's an answer in the future, and treat time as the way of getting that answer. So I'll write this for now, or is this decision that we're debating so hotly necessary today, or could I give it a break? I kind of like that. There's a piece in 97 Things Every Programmer Should Know that Bert Hufnagel wrote, and it is very much along the line. It's called Put the Mouse Down and Step Away from the Keyboard. So great title, but it's just that idea of like, you got so obsessed into the detail, and we do that with either we're debating with colleagues, or we're just in the code. We're trying to solve a problem. Either it's a bug related problem, or it's a kind of like, which way should the code go? How should I solve this? What's a way of refactoring this? I'm sure there's a more elegant thing here, and we're absolutely get drawn into it. And it's just like, okay, put the mouse down, step away from the keyboard, take a break. Go and have a herbal tea. Go home. Leave this one. It's late enough already. Or if you're already at home, go for a walk. Go and bake sourdough bread. I don't know. Just unless this is absolutely critical now, go and do something else. Let your brain just chill out, and good night's sleep, or just stepping away from something is often enough to go like, oh, okay. There's either an answer becomes apparent, or you realize there's a bigger issue at stake, and you are just seeing a very small part of it. Let time give you the answer. We're in such a rush for most things, and not everything has a deadline. Sometimes you can leave this till tomorrow, put something down, leave it till tomorrow, and time gives us the answer. It doesn't always do that, but honestly, time is a really helpful kind of pairing partner. You can pair on your own with time. It's me and time, and this is how we're going to do this. Time will give me the answer to some of these things, and we throw that out there as a hypothesis. If you treat your code as a hypothesis, it's my current thinking. That doesn't mean it's the last word you have on it, but it is the first word. And now you've got it out. You've got something you can point to. It's really difficult to point to a thing and say, let's refactor a thing that's in my head. Sometimes you just need to get that out there. Maybe that's the best way to do it. So to really try and approach a lot of these things with a much broader view, that there's not just one way. Sometimes step back, sometimes just honestly commit at that point and just write stuff. But with that acceptance, I mean, this is something I get from, I also do creative writing. I write short fiction. And one of the kind of standard things that's said within the writing community is that the first draft is for you. The second draft is for other people. But it's that idea of there is a redrafting process. I think Ernest Hemingway said all writing is rewriting. It took software developers nearly a century after he said that to come up with the idea of refactoring as a formal first-class practice. But that idea of like, you're always kind of reshaping this. We should treat our software should be soft. So therefore it's a reshapeable, remoldable thing. It's just like, yep, here's my thinking. And, I've changed my mind. My colleague has just come in and sort of said this and that. Oh, okay, here. What do you think? And to treat it as this kind of flow, this genuine flow between people, that it can, that's why we have version control systems, because it's not just so we can remember a version. It's just so that it captures the flow and evolution. It allows us to always fall back to the last known thing and say, I came up with a brilliant idea. Guess what? It wasn't so brilliant, but we've got something we can go back to. We've always got that. And that simple idea it allows us to be more human. I think that's about, I think we everything from the undo option, everything from that, all of these things, refactoring tools, undo, version control, they all allow us, we dream up all kinds of wonderful technical reasons why they're great tools, but actually the dirty secret is they just allow us to be more human, and to take advantage of the things that we're actually quite good at, which is not always coming up with a eureka moment. It's sometimes it's a dawning realization. It's just like, oh, now I understand. You said that 6 months ago. Yeah, I was wrong 6 months ago. Now I understand. Should I put something in the calendar for 6 months from now when you will truly understand? And again, it's that reminder of like, oh yeah, this is how we roll, quite literally.
My trick is showers.
Yeah.
Yes.
He always comes out of the shower with some sort of idea.
Yeah, but
Some is good.
funny thing, it's not always good. Yeah, but this is this lovely thing. So so a friend of mine, I used to work with him. We still do work. We're although work independently. John Jagger, he actually ended up getting a diver's pad for the shower for this very reason.
What
a
now?
diver's pad. Divers, they need to write things down. If you are underwater. I've just seen you're sitting there going like, I can tell after this podcast you're going to be online divers pads. But yeah, a pad and pen that you can write on underwater, so that he could keep a pad and pen in the shower. Genius.
I had no idea this existed.
No, he was actually talking about painting the whole bathroom in whiteboard color. So
well, don't let me stop you doing that probably... as well. Yeah.
Please do.
Oh yeah, sorry. Humans. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We don't want to break up the happy marriage, but
no, it's okay. I have a bathroom downstairs. He can have the bathroom upstairs. That's fine. I have a bathtub. He has a shower. I'm fine.
So social spaces.
Paint, you can paint.
Yeah. There we go. The work assignment. Yeah, responsibilities.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it is exactly that. It's one of the reasons that back in the days when I used to have places to go, I would keep I keep a pad and pen in my car. It's not because I look, honestly, the notes that I leave myself are absolutely terrible. But when I'm driving, if it's on the motorway, I will sometimes just like, right, okay, I'm going to write this, and it's this kind of idea of like writing without looking. Plus but it's normally just a reminder, I know some people are a little more, they will say, oh, I'm going to record this. And there's a lot of people have different approaches, but all of this it's because you're taking a step back from your normal kind of linear thinking. The ideas, in fact, I used to have a term for it. It was a company I once worked at. I used to call them slip road moments, because the slip road is the road that joins the motorway. It's the run up to the motorway. You're leaving the local road system, and now this is the road. We're not yet at full motorway speed. We're not part of the flow, but we're accelerating towards it. I used to call these slip road moments because I would drive from work, and the motorway, I'd leave the site. It was a large site that we had, very much a factory style site. And then I would drive, get through the gates. It's about a 5-10 minute drive to the motorway. And then normally whatever had been on my mind, just as I was on the slip road, would suddenly solve itself. Massively dangerous. You're about to join high speed traffic flow. But I used to call these slip road moments because either it was a problem I'd been struggling with, or it's just like, well, that's an interesting idea. If I split that class in two and did, okay. So when I got home, I would never get out of the car immediately. It's just like, right, pen, paper, write this one down, or rush into the, it was a case of like rush into the flat and then write it down, mustn't let this one go. But that's simply because it's like you've let everything go. You step back. Yeah. It's exactly what Bert was saying. And the idea of put the mouse down, step away from the keyboard. But you've got to appreciate that. And again, that goes back to that whole idea of like, we're so obsessed with fast, that there's almost no space for this kind of thinking. And actually that's one of the most valuable things, is that give ourselves the space, and then the good stuff happens. Then all of the great ideas happen. It's not to say nothing good happens while we're at the keyboard, but you've got to recognize it doesn't all happen at the keyboard. Some of it is because you stop. It's an artifact of doing that. We've loaded everything up, and it's just like, and now, okay, go have a shower, bake sourdough. Don't mix those two together. I'm sure the results will not be very good.
No.
But feel free to experiment. Again, I'm not going to presume to answer your question.
I mean, the steam would probably increase.
Yeah. Why bake? You could steam. And then we invent steamed buns. It's just like that's how they were invented. But there's this idea. But there's this idea of being able to just recognize that if knowledge is what we do, then thinking is clearly an important part of it, and understand that humans don't think in a linear logical fashion, that is one of the ways of thinking. It's that there's a whole bunch of tools that we can borrow to help us get better ideas and to understand what we're trying to work on from a different point of view. And some of that is dive straight into the code, immerse yourself in the code. Some of it is actually, and we're good. Leave that to one side. You've kind of like, impressed on your brain all of this stuff. Now do the thing that you weren't doing, which is not look at code. Now go and do exact opposite. If you're sitting down, stand up. If you were standing up, sit down. In other words, do the opposite of whatever you were doing to bring yourself to a different place. It just changes the way you're looking at something, and you might not even be doing it consciously. And I think that we don't understand that if we think of software development as a production thing, and that is one area, by the way, where I do depart from the kind of classic lean thinking. I think that production metaphors, there's no such thing as a perfect metaphor, but we need to understand that their limit is, we cross the limit of applicability much sooner than for other metaphors. In other words, every metaphor has a point where it breaks. Metaphor shear, I think Neil Stevenson called it. You end up with metaphor shear, where the point where actually the whole thing's fallen apart, this metaphor no longer applies. It doesn't mean it's a bad metaphor, because this is one of those things that some people they over criticize metaphors. They say, well, this is not accurate. It's like, yeah, sure, it's accurate. It's accurate enough. But if it were not a metaphor, then it would, if it were an exact description of the thing, then it wouldn't be a metaphor. Metaphor is not identity. We use metaphor because it's not identity, because it allows us to approach a complex subject from something more familiar or simple. But it always has a boundary. There's always a limit beyond which the metaphor stops working. And if you don't recognize that, you will run across it and hit all the problems. But the idea with production, software is not manufacturing, or rather, it is manufacturing in the sense that when I give source code to a compiler, it manufactures executable code. There you go. We solved the manufacturing problem in the 1950s. That's kind of like, that's Grace Hopper and John Backus. That's COBOL and COMTRAN and Fortran and all of those. The manufacturing problem is a solved problem. We're done with that. And we've been getting progressively better at dealing with the manufacturing and assembly part, continuous deployment being the latest manifestation of that. The bit that we're left with is the not production bit. And writing code is not production. Writing code is organizing your thoughts. It's using a formal notation to say, okay, here's how we're going to approach this. I'm going to try and bring this piece of technology, and there's this application objective, this requirement. I'm going to try and bring these together, and this is how I'm thinking about it. It's applied thought. And when we start realizing, thinking, that's what we do. It's not manufacture. You're not manufacturing stuff when you do that. You're organizing your thoughts. You're structuring that. And so therefore, you better have some really good techniques for thinking. And that, I think, is the bit that we've been missing collectively as a profession, is just like, different techniques for thinking. That's what makes the difference. It's not, sure, typing speed is going to make a little bit of a difference, but honestly, not much. I've only met one person for whom I think typing speed was the ultimate productivity differentiator. And he was a one-finger typist. He was, most people who say they're one-finger typists are actually two-finger typists. They have one on each hand, But Rod was a one-finger typist, and you can tell how far back this was because he was also a smoker, and it's just, he could smoke in the office. I can't remember. Right. This is like, So folks out there, young people, know that this was possible, But the point is that he would be smoking, with one hand and typing with the other. You could always tell the machines that he'd been on because there was ash on them. But for him, yes, typing speed was the bottleneck in development. But for pretty much everybody else, actually the bottleneck really is the ability to organize your thoughts. Now, of course, having shortcuts and having more effective things allows you to get the flow better. So definitely there's a benefit there. But the real thing ultimately is this thing. And we're just not very good at we're surprisingly good at using it. But that's the word, surprising. We could be better. We could organize our work or recognize that some of the practices that we get so kind of almost quasi-religious about is actually there are reasons why they do make sense, but perhaps it's not as absolute as we thought. That it's to do with how we think. It's to do with how we communicate. Communication. That's how to get a thought from one person's head to another, and it's never going to be perfect. In the absence of telepathy, it's never. And telepathy would be a disaster for civilization as we know it. I mean, honestly, knowing what other people thought would just be the end of the human race. But communication comes from the Latin communis, together. That's what it means. That communication is a form of togetherness. We're trying to get somebody else. We're trying to share a thought. We're trying to literally, and that's what code is. We are sharing thoughts in a formal notation about how we're going to build something. And that may change with time, but it also changes with people as they see different things. And I think when we look at it like that, it's just like, it's not manufacturing at all. So manufacturing metaphors can be helpful up to a point, but then you realize to get beyond that point, you need something else. And that it probably gets drawn in from more economics, sociology, psychology, philosophy, all of these things.
I really like this.
Yeah. So it's sleep roads for you, it's showers for you, and for Frederick, it's any activity that allows his brain to process but doesn't allow him to start working.
Yeah.
So there's all different kinds. For me, it's color sorting my t-shirt drawer. Or alphabetically sorting the spices after you mess them up.
Or whatever is the right order right now.
Yes.
So you color
Because that
sort.
does-
So
Yeah.
speaking as a slightly colorblind person, I think if I try to color sort my t-shirts, I have my t-shirts done in terms of frequency of use. I have three shelves and so therefore it's much more like a most recent cache. It's a recency cache. So I have to bend down to get the ones I don't use very often, and then the other ones are higher up.
But I have a complex system, I think, because I have the nerd superhero kind of t-shirts, and they are in color, and then I have the crazy cats t-shirts, and they are in order, and then I have the grown-up t-shirts, and they are in color order. So I don't mix.
Ooh. You don't cross the streams.
I don't know.
Yeah. I don't think I have any. I think I had a slightly different system. I used to have a kind of like a band t-shirts, but I can't remember the last time I had a band t-shirt. But yeah, I used to have band t-shirts, and I used to have them kind of in some kind of vague structure, but I could do. But when if I go back to when I first got together with my wife, there would have been no point in color sorting my t-shirts because they were all black. Pretty much most of my clothing was black.
Then
and so
you
therefore,
would go by how much print is on it.
Yeah, I guess, it's like how much color appears on it, or how much
And he
print.
thinks I'm joking.
No, I know. I did actually have a t-shirt that was black, and it was hash 000000.
Oh, nice.
In black on it. It was just a slightly different shade of black. And I don't believe it was hash 00, but it was a close enough, to make the joke. Yeah. But you could catch it in the light. So yeah, that would definitely go right. That would be it. And then the brightest of them would be graded towards the top.
There you go. Yeah.
Too much sorting.
I've tried to do that for Jimmy's drawers as well, but I've given up. I just put them in a pile. Here, you can put them in the drawer because I will get so sad, or I want to redo it every time. So just here's a few t-shirts.
There's some kind of metaphor here about working on the same code base, but I'm not quite sure what where I'm going to take this one. I don't want to push. I don't want to push this to a point where it causes friction in the marriage. So but
but the funny thing is that you are the other way around when it comes to code. It should be neat. It should be really organized, and yeah. But that's why I'm not coding anymore.
I'm giving you the opportunity to think. Because you were thinking
the thing I'm thinking when I see your t-shirt drawer is, how the heck did this happen? And what tornado was it?
What went wrong in Jimmy's life that would produce this kind of drawer configuration? You've got to ask the deep psychological questions at this point.
Yeah. And he would probably think the same way about my sock drawer, which is also color sorted and by different sizes.
Yeah. What did Jessica's upbringing cause the trauma that led to this level of organization of socks?
I don't know. I'm sorry, Mom, if you're here. Which she actually is sometimes. So she may be.
But there is.
I don't know.
There is a thing.
It's so pretty, and I feel so calm.
Right. So there we go. Human psychological need, because that's the interesting thing is I'm looking at my my desk. It's a good job I don't have a second camera, because my desk it's getting a little bit out of control, and I am now back at the point where we could start talking geological layering. It's like, where is that? Oh, hang on, I know, that was 3 weeks ago, so it's this deep. I know how to dig. So it's like dig far enough, and it's just, it's the KT boundary. We'll find dinosaurs beyond this. But the desktop on my laptop, oh man, that is clean. That is just like, there is nothing there. Everything is there. There is no disorder. There is nothing. It is pure. It is simple. My desktop background is a black and white photograph that I took. It is just like the extreme minimalism. It is exactly unlike my real desktop. They are perfect opposites. And so, and we do end up with this kind of like mild chaos, these curious opposites. Some of my books are incredibly organized, but some of the books that I share with my wife and those bookshelves, they were once organized, but they are no longer organized. Except for the graphic novels. That's now totally under my control. I have completely and I have reclaimed the graphic novels I've lent my sons, and it's just like, let's bring them towards me, and let's put these in an order which is partly chronological, partly associative, partly, we'll put all the Alan Moore stuff here. And it's just like, so in other words, there's little local regions of extreme order that's surrounded by this kind of like chaos. And
that
emergent.
Sounds kind of like what Lars is saying here. He's quite sure the messier the developer's desk is, more organized code. Honestly, the code, I'm really, I really care about this. I really care about that desk. It's just like, I have so many different bits of papers and books and, as I say, layers of stuff. Now, this is not what people meant when they talked about layered architectures. I'm pretty sure about it. Might be.
Well, that's funny, because years ago, there is this curious assumption, the words that we use, layers. And I remember talking to a developer, it was an old embedded developer. You kind of got the feeling he started his career just like with ones and zeros, and he's crafted everything else out of the ones and zeros since then. And I was talking about, how to organize our code and all of these kinds of ideas, and the guidance for modularity and various practices and how they interact. And I mentioned layering at one point, and then he kind of had a comment, said, you really got to watch out for layer code. I just don't like it. It's just such a problem. And I couldn't really understand where he was coming from. So in the break, we had a chat, and it's really interesting because kind of a lot of the, if you like, the mainstream thinking of ideas had bypassed him. He'd kind of grown up in the electrical engineering and embedded space rather than the more computer science influenced space. So when he heard the word layered code, he wasn't thinking, the layered architecture of separate, how we think about operating systems and large applications, or network protocols, all this kind of stuff. Layering offers us a really simple mental model for understanding a separation of concerns at a large scale. And it gives us a model for reasoning, and we can refer to it, even if there's no artifacts in the code, or we can talk about, that's kind of the database layer. We have a kind of, it's like a shared map and understanding. So all of these uses of layering, we tend to think of as being very positive. And it was only when I spoke to him that it turns out that his understanding of layering, quite obvious and intuitive really, was archaeological layering. As in, it's just like, it's the way that one civilization will build on the remains and ashes of the previous one. And so therefore that's the layering. And he was talking very much about legacy layering of like, you got this code, and then you kind of pile another piece of code, and then somebody says, we need a wrapper, and then we need a wrapper to solve our legacy, and within 2 years that's already become legacy, and so on. And you end up kind of like so I've ended up calling that since then archaeological layering to distinguish it. But I think that's but it was really interesting too, the way that he came at that word without any other context. He wasn't seeing it as a positive thing. That was his default assumption. archaeological layering, and it's just like, oh yeah, we're just piling shit up. It's just like eventually you just end up with this kind of like Jenga tower that is your architecture. It's like, okay, who's going to move?
Well, I've
Who's
seen
going to
code
move?
like
No,
that.
I'm not touching that. Yeah. Jenga architecture, I think, is a thing. It's just like, well, I'm not touching it. Yeah, you touch it, it's your code. No. It's got your name on in the version. Yeah, but you wrote it originally. Yep, but I wasn't the last person to touch it. It's not mine. You touch it, it's just like the whole thing collapses. It's just like, you broke it. It's like, no, it was broken before I got there. It's so you end up with these kind of like fragile assumptions being built up. But yeah, I do think there's definitely again, that's a perception and a psychological and sociological thing.
Yeah, we have Stacy and also Frederick is on that team. So I think I'm the odd one out here.
So if Lars is correct with that assumption, can you imagine how organized my code is?
Yes. It's the most organized, well, the second maybe. I've seen images on the internet, but maybe.
So basically, we should conclude with something meaningful out of this. That's going to be the Angstrom inversion. In other words, it's just like the Angstrom inversion is just like, the more chaotic I am in real life, the more organized I am within the computer. This is my domain. It is a domain of order, and I displace all the chaos to the outside world. It's a displacement kind of theory, and
that's the reason I don't code anymore, because my drawers are very organized. So you can imagine what that means for the code.
It's just like, I'm just slinging code here. Did it fall off? No, that's good enough. Ship it. It's just like, throw that one there.
Were you here?
Throwing Jenga pieces.
Yeah, you're all throwing socks. Honestly, my sock drawer looks a little more like that. So my sock drawer is the height of,
Mine are folded and they're folded in a special way so they can stand up, and they have different
Yeah, some of mine hang out together. Some of mine are folded together. Some are not. The pairs that they're in are sometimes not really proper pairs. They're kind of like sort of speed dating kind of pairs. It's just like, hey, you guys try out together for a while.
When I put it, sometimes Jimmy puts in the clothes, and sometimes I do the laundry. That is, and I cannot give him the socks because he thought he had solved the problem by buying only black socks. But my issue is that some socks are washed way more than the other socks, and they cannot go together.
Different shades of black, they age at different rates, Again, it goes back to this kind of like, oh yeah. Well, if it helps, I want to make sure that we close out with a sense of order and peace here. I've mostly been bare when I'm in the house, and honestly, I've been, everything I've done for the last year is housebound. I'm pretty much barefoot. So in other words, I am sockless. My sock drawer has not seen as much activity in the last year. And the weather has just gotten a little bit better, that I'm more likely to wear sandals if I drive. I was just dropping my son off at something earlier on. It's just like, sandals. So the socks don't really see much activity. So they haven't been through the wash very much. So my socks are actually pretty much, they're kind of like a suspended animation, sock stasis, since like 13 months ago, because it's basically, I work from home, if I do training and workshops, they're all at home, and I'm just barefoot. So basically, if anybody joins any of my training courses online, just know that while I'm sitting here, I am barefoot. And if you have a problem with that, I'm sorry, but I'm not, I'm definitely a barefoot worker when it comes to that. So sockless, that's how I've unasked the question. Within my house, I am sockless, and there is no sock question.
Yeah, I do the same thing. The only sockets that I have is WebSockets.
No, you didn't. You did not.
He just did. I think he might have done. I think he might have done it in a way that's been recorded. Yeah, that's and you can't take it back.
We started out with a bad joke, and we ended with a bad joke.
Yeah,
that's the way we're going.
Yep.
Yeah, excellent.
What happened to the being chicken part? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, clearly this is how we
I'm
scroll.
dangerous.
As long as you don't touch my sock drawer or my t-shirt drawer, you
Exactly.
may live.
Every relationship has boundaries. Yeah, and I think
Yeah,
we've just discovered.
I don't touch your code.
Don't touch my code. Don't touch my socks. Okay, we're agreed. There you go. Social negotiation.
Yes. Unless I can color sort your code.
Yeah, I think, Jessica, you're going to have to publish. This is the second time you use the phrase color sort, and I really feel there is an algorithm out there that wants to be, created. I think I don't know what it is yet, but I feel that the community should come up with something that qualifies as a color sort. I think that there's something.
Yeah, because
there.
it is an issue. Because if you're sorting, if you're using the rainbow as a reference, you still have no room for the whites, the blacks, the creams, the browns, and all of that. You know how many years research and trial and errors and stuff that I've been through? I shouldn't admit this on a recording, should I?
This is definitely a clip.
No.
Yeah, again,
Yeah,
you've admitted stuff. You can't take it back. It's been recorded. It's out there. People are going like, Jessica, did you hear? Did you hear? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
That's
my
the way it
proposal for color sort, just off the top of my head, is that you basically look at the first 48 bits of your data and treat it as an RGB code, and use that as an alternative hashing approach. There we go. That's my first offering. But I'm sure people can come up with a much better approach. But yeah, or try take if what we're sorting is text based, then what color is this word closest to?
Ooh,
Yeah,
I like
there's a lot of
that
stuff
one.
there. But also, although I'm slightly colorblind, I am synesthetic. So I think of numbers and sometimes words in terms of colors. So you can have a personal synesthesia. So for me, S and C sort together, for example, even though they're complete different points in the alphabet, they are similar kinds of colors. 5 and 6 sort together, but curiously enough, so do 4 and 7. So this could be really interesting. Oh yeah, it's a
We should make
Kevlin,
it a
you just
project.
you completely messed up the ordering of this. There's no rational ordering. This is completely unspecified arbitrary ordering. It's like no. Look, all the reds are sorted together, and all the what do you mean reds? Oh, I see these as red. Okay, right. And at that point, they're stepping away very, very slowly. But yeah, that's a possibility as well.
Yeah, that would be
Okay,
interesting.
I also just realised that we are all wearing various shades. I've got this, and there's pink and red. I've just realised we are actually colour coordinated, even though I didn't end up with a cool hat or cool ears. But there is a colour coordination here. There we go.
All right.
Yeah,
We are a little bit over time.
We are. So I will post the Blazor UI components for those of you who want to try them out. And thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a blast.
And now I need to rethink my sock drawer.
Life choices.
And we will be back on Tuesday already. So please join us then.
Thanks, everybody.